Hi, everybody. I believe that people are still in the process of joining us, so I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds before I kick things off. Okay, thank you everyone for joining what's proven to be quite a popular event looking at Scotland's draft Natural Environment Bill. We had 127 people register, so there's clearly an appetite to find out more about this bill. We're the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management, or CIEEM for short, and we're delighted to be also joined today by Dan Paris of Scottish Environment Link, he's Director of Policy Engagement, and David Fleetwood, Director of Policy at the John Muir Trust. So in the course of the next hour, we're going to give you an overview of the bill, followed by an opportunity to hear the views of our panellists and also to put your questions to them. Just a note, if you could please add your questions to the Q&A section of Zoom, because they're most likely to be picked up there. But if you have any general points that you want to make over the course of this webinar, you can also pop those in the chat, but ideally questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder, this event will be recorded, so it can be circulated to everyone attending, and it will also be made available to the general public. So a bit about CIEEM. We're the professional body for ecologists and environmental managers. We have around 8,000 members in total and over 800 in Scotland alone. Our mission is to raise the standards and profile of professional ecological environmental management for the benefit of nature and society. And our members, as you can see, come from across a range of sectors. CIEEM today is represented by Julie Bhatti, our Vice-President-elect for Scotland, Annie Robinson, our Scotland Coordinator, and myself, Ashley Buchan, Policy Officer for Scotland, Wales and the Island of Ireland. Unfortunately, Caroline McParland, one of the major driving forces behind our involvement in the bill, has lost her voice today and so won't be participating verbally, but she is with us and may pop comments into the chat as needed. So I'm going to get things started with a brief background to the bill and its contents before I hand over to Annie and the panel. So the draft Natural Environment Bill was laid before the Scottish Parliament in February of this year. It's currently at stage 1 and expected to receive royal assent in 2026, at which point it will become an act. The bill builds on the Scottish biodiversity strategy and associated delivery plans, which were published in autumn of last year. The bill is said to be a response to having lost powers following the UK's exit from the EU, or Brexit, specifically the ability to update environmental impact assessment legislation and habitats regulations, but we'll go into more detail on this in a bit. It's comprised of 4 parts, which we'll go through briefly, one by one. Each component of the bill has its roots in earlier consultations, responses to which can be found on CIEEM's Resource Hub, along with our response to the recent Rural Affairs and Islands Committee call for views. So part 1 of the bill sets out the framework for statutory nature targets. It's important to note that it doesn't detail the specific targets themselves because these will follow later as part of secondary legislation. However, the bill does require that draft targets are laid within 12 months of Section 1 coming into force. Sorry, Section 1 of the Act coming into force. Realistically, this probably means that we won't have targets until the latter half of 2026. But the bill does require that ministers introduce a minimum of 1 target under each of 3 areas. These are on the screen. So that's condition or extent of any habitat, the status of threatened species, and the environmental conditions for nature regeneration. There's also a 4th, any other matter topic, under which ministers can introduce a target that doesn't fit in these preceding areas. In practice, it's quite likely that what we'll have is a suite of targets under each of these, as is appropriate to capture the complexity of biodiversity in Scotland. Ministers are also required to take scientific advice on the targets and to appoint Environmental Standards Scotland, or ESS, that's our environmental regulator, to provide independent oversight. Moving on to part 2 of the bill, where the bulk of CIEEM's attention has been focused. While the bill's generally been a positive and welcome piece of legislation, this is the part that's raised considerable concerns amongst the environmental sector. That's because the bill, as it's introduced, would give ministers the power to amend 2 important pieces of environmental protection, specifically the EIA legislation and the habitats regulations. The habitats regulations have provided us with some of the most fundamental protections for nature for decades now. They've been legally tested and found robust in helping to protect valuable habitats. The EIA legislation requires that potential environmental impacts of major developments are scrutinised so that these can be avoided, reduced and offset at the earliest possible stage. Now, according to the bill, amend would in this case include to revoke or repeal, which, especially in the absence of non-regression clause or any other safeguards, creates the potential for changes to be made with little justification or scrutiny, such that they could become weaker or even be removed altogether. Usually, existing law would only be amended through the creation of new primary legislation, but in some cases, ministers can use what are called Henry VIII powers to amend law through secondary legislation. Now, while there are arguably some circumstances where use of these Henry VIII powers can be expedient, the proposal to use them here is concerning because secondary legislation doesn't undergo the same level of scrutiny or oversight as primary legislation. Unlike with bills, Parliament cannot amend secondary legislation, it can only approve or reject the government's proposals. There's also little by way of specific examples of the circumstances in which these powers could be used. Rather, the policy memorandum argues that it's not possible to anticipate all uses of the power and that legislation needs to be made future-proof. Furthermore, there's no acknowledgement in the policy memorandum of the existing powers in current legislation. This is something which we highlight in detail in our response to the call for views and which we'll doubtless touch on as part of the panel discussion. So I won't cover all the proposals on national parks in this slide, but I do encourage you to read Scottish Environment Link's excellent series of blogs on the bill, which give more detail about these and other proposals. You can find links to these at the end of this presentation. Scotland's national parks already have 4 aims set out in law. A potential overarching purpose for the parks has not been included in the bill, but the bill does propose modest changes to the 4 aims, including some tweaking of language, for example, from sustainable use of natural resources to sustainable management and use of natural resources. The bill also adds a subsection that gives more detail on the specific activities underlying each of the aims, including restoring and regenerating biodiversity in the area and mitigating and adapting to climate change. There are 2 changes to the responsibilities of public bodies as proposed. The first is a new duty for public bodies, and that includes ministers and local authorities to have regard to the aims of the national park. The second is the strengthening of a duty for public bodies in relation to park plans so that they must facilitate implementation of the plans rather than simply have regard to them. On part 4, many of the proposals relating to deer management come from a report of the Independent Deer Working Group, which gave recommendations for the reform and modernisation of deer management in Scotland back in 2020. The Scottish Government accepted most of the recommendations, and their subsequent inclusion in this bill is welcome. The prospect of new deer legislation comes at a time when numbers of all 4 species of deer are record numbers, estimated at 1 million animals across the country. While deer are important and an iconic part of our natural heritage, the problems associated with their unsustainable populations are evident. We're therefore supportive of the implementation of a new ground for Nature Scot to use its powers to intervene to restore nature, rather than just to prevent damage, as has been the case. So a little bit on CIEEM's activities to date. We've met with Scottish Government officials through the Scottish Environment Link and also separately with Nature Scot to raise our concerns, particularly with part 2 of this bill. We've submitted a response to the committee's call for views, as well as contributed to Scottish Environment Links. We've also added these and news updates to the CIEEM website, newsletter and LinkedIn, which is something that we expect to continue for the foreseeable future as we get more clarity on what the final bill is going to look like. Coming up, we've been invited to give evidence to the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee on the 21st of April. You'll be able to follow that and also find a recording on scottishparliament.tv. We're also meeting with MSPs alongside Scottish Environment Link. And how you can get involved, you can follow CIEEM on LinkedIn or visit our website for news, updates and calls to action, but you should also follow Scottish Environment Link's blog and social media if you aren't already. So these are the links in the slides. We will also share these slides along with the recording of this webinar. Thank you very much. If you wish to get in touch with us, you can do so at policy@ciem.net. And now I'm going to pass over to Annie for the panel discussion and audience Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ashley. If you just want to stop sharing. Yep, you've already done. I've put the links to the Scottish Environment Link blogs that Dan has produced in the chat, and also our call for views. It's the 21st of May, the evidence session. It was in April on the slide, but it's definitely next Wednesday. So don't panic, Caroline, who's giving the evidence session on behalf of CIEEM. So yeah, next Wednesday, please do look on Scottish Parliament TV. And that will be the 4th of evidence sessions that the committee have held on different components of the bill. So I'm now going to pose some questions to the panel. And while I do so, if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A, which is the little square box with a question mark. And we'll come to those afterwards. If you've just got general comments, experiences, views that you've read with the Natural Environment Bill, or just that you want to share with other people attending today, please feel free to use the chat, which is where I've just been posting the links. But in particular, for questions, please pop them in the Q&A. And if the question is directed at a particular panel member, if you can just note that at the start, and that will help me direct who to ask the question to. So I'm going to start with Dan Paris. So Dan is the Director of Policy and Engagement at Scottish Environment Link, and we've been working very closely with Link on the Natural Environment Bill and scrutinising various elements of it, which is fantastic. So Dan, first question to you. Is Scottish Environment Link supportive of the need for statutory nature targets in Scotland, and if so, why?
We are supportive of statutory nature targets. In fact, it's Scottish Environment Link and our members have really been pushing for nature targets to be introduced for some time now. Actually, the roots really of the Natural Environment Bill are right back in the sort of the immediate era following Brexit, when Link launched our Fight for Scotland's Nature campaign, which I have to say was before my time at Link, so I can't take any credit for this success. But that campaign had 3 main asks, which were intended to close the environmental governance gap that Brexit was opening up, one of which was the establishment of an independent environmental regulator, which we've had through Environmental Standards Scotland, one of which was the implementation of the environmental principles in Scots law, which is also something which has been achieved. But the third and only outstanding ask was the introduction of legal targets for nature recovery. That was committed to in the Butte House Agreement, but it was delayed, and there was some uncertainty over whether, after the Butte House Agreement collapsed, whether the Natural Environment Bill would be introduced with statutory nature targets. So Link launched last year our Scotland Loves Nature campaign, which has been really pushing for that bill to be introduced, and we were really glad that in the previous programme for government it was included and that we now have the bill in front of us. I think fundamentally the reason why we support statutory nature targets is the fact that we've had decades of policy, of strategy, of legislative attempts to protect our environment and to stop and reverse the decline of biodiversity. And it's not worked. So we obviously need to take more ambitious action and put more investment in, but I think there also needs to be more of a legal framework which builds in a greater political accountability and incentive for government to act. We've seen with climate targets, which we've now had in the statute books for some time, that although they're imperfect and they certainly don't guarantee that you're going to meet the outcomes that you set, I think that having them as legal targets does build in higher political profile. It does build in structures of independent advice, of oversight, and of scrutiny that has been lacking for nature. And so we feel that the introduction of these statutory nature targets can do a similar job as what climate targets have done, which is to build in that sort of long-term policy certainty that we know that this is the direction which we're going to be driving government policy over the long term, where there's a shared ambition that not just government, but also NGOs, private landowners, other actors all understand the direction of travel and what the intended outcomes are. But also, I think it's important that it builds in that level of accountability and make sure that we keep nature in the political agenda in the way that climate targets have kept climate in the political agenda.
Thanks very much, Dan. And yes, I think there was a little cheer around the virtual room when we saw it added into the Natural Environment Bill. And certainly would recommend, there was a report produced by Scottish Environment Link on nature targets, last year. Ashley, you could maybe dig it out and put it in the chat for people to look at. So there was a small working group of us that worked on it, and Lloyd Austin saw the report, and it's a really important piece of work. So the approach taken at the moment in the draft bill is to require ministers to set targets under those three main areas that Ashley highlighted. And then there would be more detailed metrics set under the secondary legislation. What would you like to see it link as the overarching targets, and what would you expect and want to see in that secondary legislation in terms of the detail?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of that approach, that is completely in line with the Link report that you mentioned, that Lloyd Austin was the lead author on, of having the sort of a framework in the primary legislation that said what there needed to be targets on, but for the detail and the metrics to be set under secondary legislation. I think that the climate targets issue, where the government was unable to meet a target which had been set in primary legislation, so the specific metric was in the face of the law, and which we then had to then go back and open up the legislation to fix the problem that they'd encountered by failing to meet the target. Meant that I don't think it was ever realistic, even if we had pushed for the government to sort of put metrics in the face of the bill or have really specific targets at this point. But also, I don't think we would have wanted that, because biodiversity being so inherently complex and with changing science, I think it would have been a hostage to fortune and potentially counterproductive to try and squeeze all the detail that we wanted into the Act itself. So having these sort of headline targets which say what the targets must be set against the topics are in the bill, and then having the detail in secondary legislation is I think, appropriate. I think inevitably we have some different views as the bill drafters on what those targets should be. So one reading of the bill is the very minimum that the government would be able to do and to meet their requirements would be to set one target under three topics: one on habitat, one on species, and one on sort of wider environmental conditions. As Ashley said in the presentation, our expectation is not that there will be a single habitat target or a single species target, but there will be a suite of targets which will sort of build in that complexity. And that's certainly what we would expect to see once we get to see the detail and the metrics of the targets after the passage of the bill. We do have some thoughts on the wording of those topic headlines. I think with habitat, the wording in the bill is setting targets on habitat quality or extent, condition or extent. Now, we would expect that the drafters are anticipating that there will be targets set both on the condition and the extent, but I think it would be useful if that was clarified in the bill, that those are sort of separate targets, both must be met. On species, the actual language in the bill is on threatened species, which I think for many of us in the conservation sector has quite a specific meaning and related to sort of IUCN Red List. One of the risks of setting targets on species is that if you draw the target too narrowly, then you can end up in a counterproductive policy environment where you're chasing, a handful of charismatic or particularly endangered species, but you aren't actually tackling the wider drivers of species decline. So I think it's really important that the species target encompasses both the most threatened species and the widespread but declining species, and even the species which could go into decline in the future. Now, the definition of threatened species that the government used in the policy memorandum is actually in line with that. So we would hope that actually in terms of the drafting of the targets, we are seeing eye to eye with officials on that at that point. But we would also want to add on, rather than just have the three compulsory targets, we would have our own thoughts on sort of additional points that could be added in there. I think a really important one is the reversal of biodiversity loss against the historic baseline. So this is something like the Biodiversity Intactness Index as an indicator, where rather than measuring against biodiversity today or even in the recent past, we're actually taking a much longer ecological view of what biodiversity could look like and measuring progress against that. And we'd also like to see a target on ecological connectivity and a specific one on the condition of protected sites, which I think is particularly important when we have 30 by 30 as a sort of non-statutory commitment, but actually it's not just designating areas as protected that's important, but it's actually improving the condition once they're designated.
Thank you, Dan. We've included many of those points as well in the CIEEM response. So Just finally, in terms of actually setting the targets, there's a proposed approach of how they'll be set out, monitored, reviewed and reported on. Do you have any comments on the process as outlined in the draft bill?
Yeah, broadly appropriate. Again, there's probably nuances there that we would like to see tightened up in the drafting. I think the role of Environmental Standards Scotland as that independent oversight body is really important. They're really the only body that was well suited to take on that role as a body which is independent of government and technically answers to Parliament rather than to ministers. The bill also does require that ministers take independent scientific advice in setting targets, which I think is really important. The bill is silent on who that advice needs to come from. It's up to ministers to determine where that advice should come from, with the only caveat that ESS have a role in commenting on the process for that. So we know that advice will come from, at least under the current government's intentions, from the Biodiversity Programme Advisory Group, or the PAG, as well as Nature Scot's Scientific Advisory Committee. Ultimately, those bodies are non-statutory, and they're appointed by ministers in one case and by Nature Scot in another case. So they are independent in the fact that they're made up of independent scientists, but they're not entirely distant and independent from government. So it is there's a suggestion which we have made in terms of the oversight of that ESS's role in commenting on that is tightened up and has more teeth, which would essentially involve any ESS comment on it being treated as an improvement report, which is a power that they have that requires ministers to respond to their comments rather than it just being a sort of commentary on the advice. But broadly, I think that the way that the government has set out that structure in the bill is positive. It does include independent advice. It does include an independent oversight body for it, and there are really clear requirements for reporting as well.
Thank you, Dan. And we've got a couple of questions coming in the Q&A, and we'll come back to those when we open up to the audience, if that's okay. But if you want to have a look in advance, that'd be great. I'm now going to move on to Julie Bhatti, who's the Vice-President-elect for CIEEM Scotland. On to part 2 of the bill. So certainly, I think Ashley referred to some of this anyway in the presentation. It's where probably the vast majority of our time has been spent scrutinising the bill. So Julie, could you cover the main concerns that CIEEM, and I know not just CIEEM, many other bodies have with part 2 of the bill at this stage?
Yes, of course. So the primary concerns with part 2 of the bill includes it includes sweeping powers to amend EIA and habitats regulations. And this word amend is specifically designed as including revoke or repeal. So in addition to that as well, there's no safeguarding on potential regression that's been included there. So we're a bit concerned about that too. These changes are proposed in part to simplify the law, but in fact, the legislation has some very simple triggers already in place. So for example, for EIA, those triggers are based on the size and location of a project. So for example, is it near an environmentally sensitive area? And some certain types of projects are always going to require an EIA regardless of location anyway. The habitats regulations have been legally tested and found robust in helping to protect valuable habitats, as we heard earlier from Ashley's presentation. The courts have defined likely significant effect, which is the key test for whether an appropriate assessment is required for a plan or project, as being capable of having an effect. So that really makes a decision on whether an appropriate assessment is needed very simple. Now, the use of likely significant effect in habitat regs appraisal contrasts with the use of the term in EIA, where significant effect is one that needs to be drawn to the attention of the decision maker in any planning application. So that could cause confusion, but only where EIA and habitats regs appraisals are conflated. They're two separate processes and two separate assessments. The only real complexity that might arise. It's the type of evidence needed to support EIA or appropriate assessment. The bill also states that flexibility in the legislation is needed to adapt to climate change. However, there are often multiple factors that are not related to climate change in that working in combination that cause the decline or loss of a species, particularly thinking about migratory species. And finally, we're thinking capacity is a big concern as well, both within local planning authorities, as shown by our survey, our recent survey by CIEEM, and more generally amongst ecologists and environmental managers, including the statutory bodies such as Nature Scot.
Yeah, I think capacity comes up time and time again,
Yes.
and skills around this. Julie, your sound is just coming in and out a little bit. If you can just adjust your headset. That's much louder and clearer.
Is that better?
Yes,
yeah, apologies,
that'd be great.
everyone.
No, that's fine. So you mentioned quite early on in that, and I think as you referred in the presentation, that habitat regulations have provided us with some of the most robust and legally tested protections for nature. And the existing powers, there are existing powers that currently exist in terms of allowing for flexibility. Can you elaborate a bit more on those powers? What are they and what can they do? And actually, are they being utilised at present?
Yeah, of course. So for habitats regulations, the key existing powers are laid out in Regulation 9D and Regulation 11. Now, Regulation 9D details the reasons for designating sites to maintain a coherent network. And Regulation 11 further clarifies the power to delist sites where necessary. Therefore, as you say, those powers already exist. So some delisting of SSSIs can happen, and often these SSSIs are also listed as either SPAs or SACs, but there is the process for delisting under Regulation 11. And the network of SACs and SPAs is just that, it's a network. So the responsibility in Regulation 9D allows ministers to adapt the Scottish part of the UK site network. This power actually gives a great deal of flexibility. It simply hasn't been used to delist an SAC or an SPA in Scotland. The habitats regs are also applied routinely on some of Scotland's critical national infrastructure. So if you look at how processes of environmental assessment across the A9 dualling programme was carried out, the habitat regulations were one means of ensuring that the many SACs and SPAs along that route are protected. Coming back to the site network, even where a development has been found to have adverse effects on site integrity, there's still a mechanism to support development going forward and protect the site network as well. And we do that through the derogation process that comes through IROPI. So where, despite the adverse effects, a plan or project is deemed to be needed for the imperative reasons of overriding public interest, and thereafter compensatory measures can be put in place as well. So for an example, in the case of the upgrading of the Fort William to Mallaig A830 road through Glenbeesdale SAC, compensatory measures secured meant that although approximately 7.9 hectares of qualifying oak woodland within the SAC was lost, an adjacent approximate 14 hectares of habitat was enhanced and included in the site, and that was achieved purely through managing deer and rhododendron to improve that 14 hectares of area. So that's a good example there where IROPI is very, very rarely used in Scotland. I think probably in the UK, I don't think many cases of IROPI has been used. But in those exceptional cases, this is a really nice example of that.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're laying out in terms of the flexibility that does exist within the existing regulations, it's finding examples of where they've been used or could have been used, I think,
yes. Yeah.
of that. A few months ago, the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee published a report on their inquiry into framework legislation and the Henry VIII powers, something that I wasn't aware of, but in terms of legal terms, I'm now learning very quickly. Those findings, do you think they've got any implications for part 2 of the Natural Environment Bill in particular?
Yes, and this is really important for the Natural Environment Bill, which is a primary or framework legislation. And this is generally accepted to mean that it sets out policy principles without the substantial detail on implementation, delegating broad powers to ministers or others to fill in the detail at a later date. So the committee noted that while framework legislation can be necessary, particularly for areas requiring frequent updates or where future circumstances can't be foreseen, the committee believes it should only be used in very limited and appropriate circumstances. So where framework legislation is used, any delegated powers should be as clear and narrowly defined as possible, with robust justification provided at the bill's introduction for why such an approach is necessary. That said, powers to amend the EIA and the habitats regs need to be rigorously justified and narrowly and clearly defined, and they aren't. And furthermore, framework powers should not be included just in case. Instead, consultation and co-design should occur before a bill is introduced to ensure sufficient policy detail is available. So that committee report was very clear in its recommendations. The powers given just in case are not acceptable. And it's vital that the Scottish Government is clear with its evidence and justification for such broad unchecked powers. So that's why it's extremely important for the Natural Environment Bill and Part 2.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. I'm sure we'll come back to some of this in the Q&A, and I know Dan's been very much scrutinising part 2 of the bill alongside other link members as well. I'm going to skip now to part 4 of the bill. We'll come back to part 3. But part 4 is all related to deer management. So I'm delighted David Fleetwood at the John Muir Trust. David fairly recently joined the John Muir Trust as Director of Policy. So fantastic you can join us today, David. So in terms of part 4 of the bill, does the John Muir Trust agree with the proposed changes in the bill to the statutory aims and purposes of deer management?
Yeah, thank you, and nice to join you in what is month 4. Time flying by already. So yeah, I think we absolutely agree that something needs to change, and we're not the only ones to be taking that position. If you look at the kind of backdrop, we've got 80% of our peatland in poor or degraded state. We've got less than 4% cover of native natural woodland, both of which are in no small part down to deer numbers. And I'm going to come back to numbers a bit later on potentially, but I think what is good to see in the bill is some emerging consensus that the numbers that we've got are too high. Arguably, people, including the Deer Commission, have been making that case since as far back as 1959. Even 2910 on the merger with S&H, the chairman was making the point at that point that the voluntary system hasn't evolved in the last 20 years, and if opportunities for reform are not taken, then other approaches will need to be considered. So it's taken us another 15 years since that observation to get to the point that change is being made. So absolutely welcome, and I think the evidence, particularly across sections 6 to 10 of the current legislation, would indicate that that is not the most efficient and effective piece of legislation in the world. Most of the interventions, of which there haven't been many, which have been made by Nature Scot under those provisions, have not delivered reductions in numbers, which is ultimately what they'd be driving at there. So yeah, strong welcome from us for attention to this particularly contentious sometimes issue, I guess.
Thanks, David. And I think what's laid out is the new grounds for intervention by Nature Scot, importantly for the purpose of nature restoration rather than just evidence of damage. So if you just got anything to add on that in particular.
Yeah, so this section is probably the critical part from our perspective of the bill. And I think as the legislation stands at the moment, Nature Scot have the power to intervene where there is the potential to evidence damage. We have seen historically, as they've tried to evidence that damage, that has been something they've found difficult to do, and I think that's a not insignificant reason for the relatively small number of interventions that we've seen under sections 6 to 10. But I suppose zooming back of that, the kind of premise of intervening on the basis of damage also effectively protects the current baseline. So if I go back to 80% of degraded peatland, less than 4% native woodland cover, if our only grounds for intervention is the potential damage to that already degraded ecosystem, then we're freezing that baseline. So the switch to the potential to intervene on the basis of restoration is an important shift that will allow us to begin to put some of those figures into reverse. So yeah, absolutely the most kind of critical part of the bill. And I think the other thing we would be hoping to see coming as a result of that is also intervention at scale. So, we know deer move through landscapes and don't particularly have any respect for ownership boundaries on maps for obvious reasons. So I think also critical that the bill is able to underpin some of the kind of landscape scale partnerships that we know we need to see to begin to tackle the impact of the high population that we've got, and act as a backstop, if you like, so we can form the basis of those partnerships on a move towards restoration, and the bill is then able to come in behind those if the partnership approach and management between adjacent landowners doesn't deliver what's needed on the ground.
Thank you, David. And last week we had the programme for government come out. Is there anything you'd like to say on what was included in relation to local deer management pilots that was included in the programme for government, and the role that the John Muir Trust and others played within that?
Yeah, thanks. And Dan might also wish to comment as a co-signatory to some of the proposals that went forwards and influenced the programme for government. I think it is good to see the government committing to some action here. It would be nice if we had seen a kind of complete commitment to a national programme, but a set of local pilots, which will allow us to build towards that national programme, is an important first step. Excuse me. And I think we've been working. Excuse me. Since the PFG, you can tell I've done lots of talking and lobbying today because I'm running out of voice, to influence what those pilots might look like. And I think as a bit of background, we working with Trees for Life particularly have done some work on potential savings we might be able to offer through a different approach to deer management. We're talking about roughly 250,000 in terms of a first year cull, and then a maintenance cull at 80,000 a year across Scotland to get us back towards a sustainable population. That's around a £59 million cost for the first 4 years, and then a recurring maintenance cost of about 15 million. You might reduce that a bit with income from venison sales. If we compare that to natural regeneration over roughly 320,000 hectares of native woodland, with deer fencing at 3,500-ish per hectare over 4 years, with fencing for that forestry, you're looking at the best part of 1.15 billion, with focusing money onto deer management instead of fencing, and letting natural regeneration give you the forestry expansion. You're down into 195 million and 59 million if you're just taking out the kind of additional cull level. So possible savings of around 900 million to the public purse if we could see some of the kind of way we currently protect new forestry moved from fencing into cull costs. So I think that's the kind of case that we'll be continuing to press as those local pilots get off the ground. And I would come back to the point around possible partnerships. I think keen to see that there is a breadth of pilots put forwards there that explores all of the issues in this space, so that we've got practical solutions. And I guess as someone coming relatively new to the space, there is definitely a feeling of some fairly entrenched arguments that have been around for a long time in the deer debate. I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anybody. But actually, I think if you look at the current political configuration and the particularly the current mathematical configuration in the chamber, what is going to begin to unlock those are the practical solutions that bring together different parties from different bits of the debate where we can create some of that consensus. So yeah, opportunities to test some of that out on the ground and build a little bit of that consensus and those practical examples is an important opportunity. So pleased to see the PFG committing to putting that forwards.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. And I think positive news, and we'll look forward to seeing what happens with those pilots and sort of the co-design and getting those off the ground. I just want to throw it out to all of you now in terms of part 3 of the bill on national parks, and just any comments from your organisation. I'm just going to Roger Cross very early on made a comment about the national parks, looking at the response that the Royal Society of Edinburgh put in, which was very closely aligned to CIEEM's own response. But he just wanted to put one exception is surely the case for the proposed changes to national parks is not justified given the twin crises and a total lack of independent review of the current national parks with respect to nature and climate. So if you could just bear that comment in mind when you're answering. So who would like to go first in terms of addressing the national parks part of the bill?
I'm happy to comment on it. The national parks bit of the bill, I mean, I'd probably describe the substance of what's in the actual bill itself as sort of as welcome, but not particularly significant. I think the background to this is that the government had, in the first instance, been looking at the introduction of a sort of overarching aim for national parks. So national parks in legislation have 4 aims that they're required to meet. The first being related to nature conservation as well as cultural conservation. But those aims are sort of balanced against sustainable development and access and other factors. So the government had been considering bringing in a sort of overarching purpose for the national parks to deliver for nature and climate. I think the wording they were looking sort of encompassed nature emergency, climate emergency, just transition, net zero. But that was the sort of the starting point, and I think why the bill has proposals to update the aims. But it's not what's been taken forward. Instead, what they've done is a sort of a modernisation of the text of the aims, which really brings the legislation into line with what the 2 national parks in Scotland are doing. So as part of this, there is a sort of, after the 4 slightly redrafted aims in the bill, there's a list which is not intended to be all-encompassing, but says, essentially notwithstanding the above aims, here's some of the things that they will include, which includes restoring and regenerating biodiversity and mitigating and adapting to climate change. Which is a very roundabout way of saying that they haven't brought in the overarching purpose, but they have tried to bring in biodiversity and climate explicitly into the legislation. But national parks already in their legislation had a clause which is sometimes known as the Sandford Principle, sometimes known as the National Parks Principle, but which says that when any of the aims of the national park come into conflict with each other, is the first aim, which is the one related to nature conservation, that takes precedence. So arguably, we already had something like an overarching purpose, albeit it's maybe not as strong as one might have been in directing national parks to maybe change some of their focus. But beyond that, there are minor changes to the national parks in relation to powers to do fixed penalty notices. National parks already have the powers to set bylaws, but we don't have the power to set fixed penalty notices related to those bylaws. And there's also, which I do think is positive, there's new duties which are being introduced on public bodies, which is one of the, I think, sort of long-standing frustrations, is that national parks set, the park authorities set a national park plan, so they have a sort of strategy for the area which covers the work that they're going to do, but then you have other public bodies operating in the park, sometimes as major landholders in the park, for example, who are not necessarily required to follow that park plan. So the two new duties relate, first of all, that other public bodies operating the park have to pay due regards to the park aims, but there already exists a duty to pay regard to the national park plan. That's being strengthened from paying regards to the national park plan to having a duty to facilitate the implementation of the national park plan, which is one of these changes in legislation that might not seem particularly significant. It's sort of a redrafting of a duty which is already there, but I think does at least show a sort of intent that the wider public sector should be delivering against the ambitions that are set out in the park plan, which I think could be really positive when it comes to something like deer management or nature restoration, where we might be able to see more of a direction given to the other public agencies, thinking in particular to Nature Scot, to Forestry and Land Scotland, to Scottish Forestry, to support those ambitions in our national areas.
Thank you, Dan. You covered a lot there. David or Julie, is there anything additional you would like to add to that?
Not really, because it does align with a lot of the response back to the call for views from CIEEM as well. We've picked up on many of those things too, Annie. So yeah, absolutely. So I think that was really, really thorough. So thank you.
Okay. If you haven't got anything to add, David, we'll move on to some of the questions that are coming in on the chat. So the first one regarding part 1 of the bill, does Nature Scot have the resources to implement, monitor the targets and support the bill? Caroline's got a hand up. Is on that one, Caroline? See if your voice stays.
Hi all. I hope you can hear me. I could just type an answer. Well, it's really a question for Nature Scot. But I did put a link to the CIEEM survey of local planning authorities in Scotland, and that survey was answered by, I think, 72% of them. If that's any reflection of the sector in general, and I think it is, then I think the answer has to be no. There's, if we've got to think about the timescales as well in terms of monitoring and reporting, and this legislation won't come into effect until 2027 in effect in terms of the targets actually being drafted. So it's a huge challenge, especially in the context of initiatives like 30 by 30 and everything else that Nature Scot is already doing. So I think really one of the best ways to make sure that this bill really does what it needs to do to safeguard our natural environment is to ensure that there are resources for Nature Scot, for Environment Standards Scotland with their role in this, for local planning authorities as well. It's certainly one of the ways that we might see a little bit more focus within local authorities on funding for nature and for biodiversity if they've got statutory targets to meet. And there's a bit more of a driver for funding to go towards biodiversity within local areas. Yeah, and I see Dan's shared a link report on 30 by 30 and the need for improved resourcing for monitoring. It takes money, it takes time, it takes people, but it's also necessary as well so that we can keep ensuring that we do meet any targets that are set. I hope that answers the question.
Caroline, we're very protective of your voice. We're Caroline giving evidence to you. We've been invited to give evidence next Wednesday on the committee. So yeah, rather deeper voice than usual there, Caroline. So thank you very much for contributing. David, would you like to come back in on that one? Put your hands up.
Thanks. Yeah, I always think depth of voice adds gravitas to the points you're making. So perfect for a parliamentary committee appearance. Yeah, I was going to come back in to add that I think as well as capacity, it's important to consider appetite, and particularly in the kind of deer elements of the bill. Then I think what we've seen in the past with Section 7 particularly has been perhaps not quite the appetite or maybe the confidence to pursue those interventions. So, there's plenty of examples, and the Dear Working Group highlighted of the 11 Section 7 agreements that were in place, we could probably say one had achieved its objectives in Glenfeshie, but there's benign ownership or certainly ownership supporting a different direction of travel there. So I guess as well as capacity, and obviously the two things are potentially linked, there's the appetite and the kind of confidence to utilize the legislation. So I think, one thing we will continue to press for is that, as well as having these powers on paper, they are used where they need to be in practice, and we've not seen that in the existing legislation.
Thank you very much, David. So I think very much the sort of capacity and expertise is very much cross-cutting, both across this bill, but also the biodiversity strategy, NPF4, and many other important bits of legislation and policy we've had through. One related specifically to deer damage. So what methods will be accepted as evidencing deer damage? I love this phrase, the full fat woodland herbivore impact assessment rather than the light touch one. And the use of the forthcoming app.
Yeah, that's probably for me, I guess. I don't think the bill has got into that yet, and I'd expect that to be set perhaps in more detail through secondary legislation, codes of practice, etc. The question highlights, I guess, a facet of the challenge that I was just talking about, though, that what we haven't seen is particularly confident intervention, and a lot of that is driven by the difficulty in evidencing damage as things stand, and there was certainly a significant conversation in the committee session that we appeared in a couple of weeks ago now around how you evidence the potential for nature regeneration. So certainly one of the things that we have been pushing for is clarity in the bill and in the underpinning statutory instruments on how that is done, so that we're not in this slightly uncertain position of concern around challenge to the evidence that is being put forwards, but there's a nice clear rationale and structure set out for what that evidence needs to demonstrate, so that the grounds and the powers for intervention are clear. That plays into the point I was just making then around giving Nature Scot as the regulator the confidence then to proceed to use those powers, rather than feeling that they're in slightly uncertain territory trying to evidence a case where they might be at risk of challenge.
Thanks very much, David. We'll come on to sort of question comment related to targets. So Arthur's saying it depends on what the targets are, the level of monitoring required. Nature Scot already undertakes environmental monitoring, so the question is whether this could be adequate or refocused, or whether statutory targets require a different level of robust data. Dan, would you like to come back in on that one possibly?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. Without seeing the sort of the detail of what the metrics are going to be, it's sort of trying to put a cost to how much that might be to monitoring is really sort of finger in the air stuff, really. I think there's an inherent tension when it comes to nature targets, when you get to the detail of actually setting a number and saying, this species needs to increase from this to this, or this habitat needs to improve by this amount. How much of that can be driven by the data that's already available, and how much of the data needs to be driven by the ambition that you want to set. We're early on in the bill process just now, so we haven't had the conversations with officials about what the sort of metrics that they'll be looking at, and the balance that they'll be looking in terms of ambition versus the evidence which is already available. But that will be, as the bill sets out, that'll all be informed by the sort of the independent advice that they get from the independent scientific boards. So I'm not optimistic or pessimistic about what the targets might be. I'm just sort of waiting to see what they will be. But I think ultimately it's a good observation that we don't know how much it might mean additional monitoring. What we can comment on is the sort of the level of monitoring which is already underway, which I think that we'd like to see more.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I think many CIEEM members that practice as ecologists and environmental managers can help feed into those targets from a sort of practitioner's perspective, but also obviously many people within this room and the environmental NGOs have got an important role to play, both in helping to feed into those targets and also scrutinising the targets. There is another question come in that looking at, no, I can't find it. Yeah, so related to what would the panel advise to ensure that other policies which have fundamental impacts on the natural environment, particular agriculture and forestry grant schemes, how are they tied in with the Natural Environment Bill? Just open to anyone that would like to answer, and then we will sum up after that one. That's okay.
I'm happy to come in on this. I think the experience with the climate targets is that the setting of the targets does help to build in that sort of cross-portfolio impact in government, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get the outcomes that we might desire. For example, I think the progress in agriculture in particular on delivering against climate targets has been really slow and really poor. I don't think the setting of nature targets in themselves would necessarily overcome those hurdles. And the two areas mentioned there of the forestry grant scheme and the agricultural payments are two areas which are long-standing priorities for Linkit and our members, looking for reform and for those to deliver more for nature. I think that what we can do in this bill is that we can look at how that sort of the mainstreaming across government could be strengthened in the legislation. And one of the ways we can do this is through strengthening the biodiversity duties. The biodiversity duty has been standing since the Nature Conservation Act of 2004. The way that this bill is actually introducing the nature targets is as an amendment to the 2004 Act, where the biodiversity duty sits and where the requirement to produce a biodiversity strategy sits. But the biodiversity duty has not been particularly impactful, and I think there are ways that it can be strengthened in the legislation in this bill, and that would not solve every problem with how we make agricultural payments work for nature. It would not solve all of our frustrations with how the forestry grant scheme might be utilised. I think it would take a step forward in that mainstreaming approach.
Thanks very much, Dan. And I see, David, you've kindly added a bit further detail onto the question of a deer app, which is one of the questions as well. So thank you for that. We'll just go on to Julie to sum up. But before I do, if anyone has any questions, comments about the bill in general, please free to get in contact with us at policy@cieem.net or individually as well. If we don't know, we will hopefully be able to direct to the right person that does. So just finish off by passing over to Julie.
Thanks, Annie. So just to sum up here, there's been lots of interesting discussion today on a really, really important bill. We've had a great presentation from Ashley explaining main elements of the bill and informative responses from our excellent panelists, Dan Paris and David Fleetwood, to all of your very searching questions, and to the audience's searching questions too. Great participation. Just with a bit of respect to timelines, CIEEM has, as Ashley said earlier, recently submitted our response on the 9th of May to Scotland Government's call for views on the bill. So that's available on our website. And if you haven't had a look at that yet, I'd urge you to read it. And our Vice-President for Scotland, Caroline, with no voice at the moment, we are very, very precious of her voice just now, will be giving evidence in the Scottish Parliament next week. And thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Dan and David. Thanks both for your expertise and your time today. It's been really appreciated. And last but not least, massive thanks to Annie and Ashley for keeping things running smoothly. You have no idea how much work goes into these webinars to make them a success behind the scenes. So just want to say thank you so much to both of you. And I think the final reminder is just to save the date for our Scottish conference, Source to Sea, which is going to be held in Stirling on the 2nd of October. Bookings are not open yet, but Annie, will you put up a link to it in the chat?
Already done.
Perfect.
It's there. Bookings will
great.
open mid-June. We've had
Fantastic.
a large amount of submissions, and the conference committee will be reviewing all of the talks and workshops that have been submitted. So yeah, bookings will open by the middle of June. So hope to see you there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and thanks again for the panelists for sharing your expertise and your time today, and Ashley for sharing that great overview of the Natural Environment Bill. So thank you all. Sarah, you can stop the recording and we can all head out into the glorious sunshine.